Nature is beautiful, but it is also a silent executioner. Tonight, we analyze 3 cases where the environment became a prison, a mountain that turned a group of hikers against each other in seconds, an ocean that swallowed a couple left behind by their own boat, and a ship that kept sailing while its crew vanished into thin air. Stay with us, because the final logbook entry of the Mary Celeste suggests that whatever happened, they didn't leave by choice. This is Terminal Trace. August 1993, Siberia. 6 hikers die in a matter of minutes. The lone survivor, Lyudmila Korovina, described a nightmare. Her friends suddenly bleeding from their eyes and ears, tearing at their own throats, and falling into a frenzy before collapsing. Forensic experts points to nerve gas or infrasound, but no chemical traces were ever found. Was it an ancient environmental toxin, or did the mountain itself trigger a mass biological failure? They were experienced, they were prepared, and yet the mountain left only one witness to tell a story no one believes.
All right, let's get right into it. Picture this. It's August 1993. We're in the Kamardaban mountain range, deep in Siberia. Now this place, it's not just some scenic wilderness. It's a massive, unforgiving landscape that's been hiding a truly terrifying secret for decades. I mean, just let that sink in. 6 experienced hikers, gone in minutes. We're talking blood pouring from their eyes and ears as they seem to tear at their own bodies, even bashing their heads against rocks. So the question is, what in the world could kill that fast and that brutally? What could make a team of experts just completely fall apart in a sudden, violent madness?
Right, a mountain of death. And here's the thing that makes this whole story just so baffling. This wasn't some group of unprepared amateurs. No, these were seasoned hikers. They knew what they were doing and they were ready for this terrain. Their leader, she was a master instructor who knew these mountains inside and out. So you have to ask, what could have possibly gone so horribly wrong?
So let's actually put some names to the faces here. The leader, she was Lyudmila Korovina, 41 years old and a literal master of sports and hiking. I mean, she was the real deal. And with her, she had 6 of her students. Look at the ages, they were so young, from just 15 to 24. These weren't strangers, they were a team. They were all trained, they all trusted Lyudmila completely, and by all accounts, their trek was going perfectly.
The survivor's nightmare. You know, pretty much everything we know, or think we know, about what happened in those final moments, it all comes down to one person, the sole survivor. A 17-year-old girl named Valentina Uchichenko. When they found her, she was so traumatized she couldn't even speak for days. But when she finally could, wow. The story she told was straight out of a horror movie.
Okay, look at this timeline. It just shows how terrifyingly fast this all went down. So it's the morning of August 5th. They've just started their descent. And then, just minutes later, Sacha, who's at the back of the group, just starts screaming. Lyudmila, the leader, runs back to help him and she collapses, hit by the exact same thing. And from there, it's just pure chaos. Tatiana starts clawing at her own throat, bashing her head against a rock. The others just drop, one by one, tearing at their clothes. And then, silence. Only Valentina is left. The whole thing was over in a matter of minutes. So according to Valentina, the first thing she saw was Sasha bleeding from his eyes and his ears. And then, as they fell, she saw them frothing at the mouth, like they couldn't breathe. She described these awful, violent convulsions, their bodies just seizing up uncontrollably on the ground. And maybe the most disturbing part of all, she said they were clawing at their own throats, tearing at their clothes, like they were trying to rip something out from inside them. Valentina, seeing all this horror, I mean, what would you do? She did the only thing she could think of. She ran. An unbelievable autopsy. Okay, so you have Valentina's story. It's horrifying, it's graphic, it is incredibly specific. But then, the bodies are recovered weeks later, and the official autopsy report comes out, and it tells a completely different story. A story that is, frankly, almost impossible to believe. I mean, just look at this. The contrast is insane. On one side, you've got Valentina's account, bleeding, convulsions, violent self-harm, total nightmare fuel. And on the other side, the official report. It says 5 of them died from hypothermia, and the leader, Lyudmila, had a heart attack. The report mentions bruised lungs, okay, and also protein deficiency, which is just weird for an experienced, well-supplied group. How do you square these two stories? They're from two different realities. It makes no sense. And this, right here, is the question that just hangs over this entire case. Sure, we know that severe hypothermia can make people confused. It can even cause something called paradoxical undressing. But does it explain how fast this happened? The sheer violence? And what about the bleeding from the eyes and ears? No way. It just doesn't add up. So if it wasn't hypothermia, then what in the world was it? All right, so let's dig into our first batch of theories. Could this have been some kind of bizarre, rare attack by nature itself? Okay, one of the biggest theories you'll hear is something called infrasound. Think of it like a sound that's so low frequency, you can't actually hear it with your ears, but your body can feel it. The theory goes that when wind whips through a mountain pass in just the right way, it can create this invisible wave of panic. It's said to cause intense dread, fear, maybe even physical symptoms. So the question is, could the mountain itself have, quite literally, scared them to death? Of course, there are other natural theories out there. What about mushroom poisoning? Maybe Ludmila, the expert, made a 1 in a million mistake and they ate something that causes psychosis. Or what if their water was contaminated? People have pointed out that nearby Lake Baikal was used as a toxic waste dump. And then there's what Valentina herself ended up believing, that it was pulmonary edema, a really bad form of altitude sickness. That could explain the frothing and bruised lungs. But could it really take down 6 healthy, experienced hikers all at the exact same time? It seems like a stretch.
So, when all the natural explanations start to feel a little thin, that's when the theories get darker, more sinister. What if this group didn't just have bad luck? What if they stumbled upon something they were never, ever supposed to see? Like a secret human experiment.
And that brings us to this word, Novichok. We're talking about a family of some of the most lethal nerve agents ever made. And here is where it gets really chilling. Novichok agents were being developed by the Soviet Union and Russia right up until, you guessed it, 1993, the exact year this happened. There are even rumors that these weapons were being tested in areas not far from where the hikers were. Okay, so this is where your jaw might drop a little. Let's just go down the list, comparing what Valentina saw to the known effects of a nerve agent. Frothing at the mouth? Yep, classic sign. Violent convulsions? Check, a primary symptom. The bruised lungs from respiratory distress? Absolutely. The leader's heart attack? Nerve agents can definitely cause cardiac arrest. It's an almost perfect match with Valentina's story. Almost. There's one big discrepancy: bleeding from the eyes. That's just not a known symptom. And that leads us to the biggest, most obvious problem with this whole military experiment theory. The Kamar Daban Range wasn't some remote, forbidden zone. It was a pretty popular tourist area. So why on earth would you conduct a top-secret, super dangerous weapons test smack dab in the middle of a public park full of civilians during peak hiking season? It just seems unbelievably reckless, right? The final mystery. So where does that leave us? We've got conflicting evidence, we've got some pretty wild theories, but no clear answers. But you know, through all of the noise and all of the speculation, there is one single fact that remains the most mysterious, the most compelling piece of this entire puzzle. That's it. One person. Out of 7 people on that mountain, only 1 walked away. 1 person saw everything and lived. A single survivor.
And this is the question that no theory, not infrasound, not nerve gas, nothing can really answer. Why her? Why did Valentina survive when everyone else died? Was it her location? You know, was she standing just a few feet away, out of range of whatever it was? Was she upwind? Or is it something about her? Some biological quirk, some rare immunity? Or was it just pure, random, dumb luck? Her survival, honestly, is the biggest mystery of them all.
So, in the end, the Kamar Daban Mountains are still there, just as silent and deadly as ever. So what do you think? Did some bizarre freak of nature claim the lives of those 6 hikers? Or did they stumble into a dark secret from a collapsing empire and become collateral damage in some awful experiment? We're left with 2 terrifying possibilities. Did the truth die with them up on that mountain? Or is it still out there, buried in a secret military file, just waiting to be found?
Imagine surfacing from a dive to see your boat disappearing on the horizon. Tom and Eileen Lonergan were left in the middle of the Great Barrier Reef after a head count error. For 48 hours, they drifted in shark-infested waters. When their gear was finally found weeks later, a diver's slate carried a desperate message. Can anyone help us? We have been abandoned. No bodies were ever recovered. Did they succumb to exhaustion, or did the shadows beneath the waves finally rise? Their trace ends where the deep begins.
All right, let's dive into one of the most chilling and, frankly, terrifying mysteries of the open ocean. It's a true story about being lost and forgotten. A story so scary it actually inspired the film Open Water. Just take a second and really imagine that. For an American couple, Tom and Eileen Lonergan, this wasn't just some scary thought experiment. On January 25th, 1998, in the vast expanse of the Coral Sea, this became their living nightmare. So Tom and Eileen were experienced divers, and they were on this absolute dream trip to Australia's Great Barrier Reef. I mean, it's a place of just breathtaking beauty. But for them, it was about to become the scene of an unimaginable ordeal. And it's so important to get this straight. These two were not beginners, not even close. Tom and Eileen were genuine adventurers. They just wrapped up a 2-year tour with the Peace Corps. So this dive trip, this was supposed to be the perfect finale to their incredible time exploring the South Pacific. They mentioned to the dive instructor that they were just going to do their own thing for a bit and swam off. You know, a totally normal decision for divers with their level of experience. But that one small, routine choice, well, it became a fatal one, because the very systems meant to protect them were about to fail completely. Later that evening, the dive boat, a vessel called the Outer Edge, headed back to port. But here's where everything went so horribly wrong. In what you can only describe as a catastrophic oversight, a final confirmed head count was never, ever done. This part is just almost impossible to comprehend. For 2 full days, while the Lonergans were presumably out there floating in the open ocean, nobody even knew they were missing. The alarm was only raised on January 27th, a staggering 48 hours later. And you know what finally tipped them off? A crew member happened to find a bag left on the boat. Inside were the Lonergans' passports, their wallet, and their shoes. The discovery of this simple bag was the very first sign that something was terribly, terribly wrong. It's what finally kicked off a massive search and rescue operation a full 2 days too late. So, a huge search gets underway. We're talking 17 aircraft, helicopters, countless boats, all combing thousands of miles of ocean. But nothing. Tom and Eileen were just gone. All that was left were these haunting clues that slowly started washing up from the deep. Over the next 6 agonizing months, the ocean slowly, piece by piece, started to give up its secrets. It actually started the very next day, when their dive weights were found. But the clues that followed painted an increasingly chilling picture of what happened out there. And then, this message, scrawled on a diver's slate and found months later, was the first concrete proof of their ordeal. It confirmed the horrifying truth. They had survived being left behind, and they were alive, fighting, and desperately pleading to be found. Okay, so that slate seems to tell a very clear story, right? A tragic accident. But this is where the whole thing takes a really strange and dark turn. The police investigation uncovered some of their personal writings, and these suggested a much, much more complex possibility. Suddenly, you've got 2 totally different stories. On one hand, you have the tragic accident. They were left behind, they dealt with exposure, maybe even a shark attack. And by the way, tears found on Eileen's wetsuit seem to support that. But on the other hand, you have these disturbing diary entries that suggest they might have planned their own disappearance. Now, their families were passionate about this. They insisted those diary entries were just isolated, dark thoughts, not some kind of plan. And they kept pointing back to the dive slate as the ultimate proof. I mean, it's a fair question, right? Why would you desperately plead for rescue if you actually intended to vanish? So with all this conflicting, really emotional evidence, the legal system had to step in and make a ruling. But even after a verdict was reached, the central mystery of what really happened to Tom and Eileen was far from over. In the end, the boat's skipper was actually acquitted of criminal charges. The company itself, though, was found negligent, fined, and eventually went out of business. The biggest consequence was that this case forced a critical look at safety failures, leading to strict new rules for the entire industry, like mandatory headcounts, to make sure this could never happen again. But here's the final haunting truth of this whole story. Despite the trial, despite the new safety rules, the ocean never gave up its biggest secret. So what was it? A horrible, preventable accident, or something else entirely? In the end, the ocean has swallowed every last piece of evidence, leaving us with nothing but questions. Their fate remains one of the sea's most unsettling and enduring mysteries.
(1872). The Mary Celeste is found sailing perfectly, sails set, cargo intact, and breakfast still on the table. But the lifeboat was gone, and so were the 10 people on board. There were no signs of a struggle. One theory suggests a leak of alcohol fumes from the cargo forced a panicked evacuation. But why would an experienced captain abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship for a tiny boat in the middle of the Atlantic? They left their gold, their clothes, and their lives behind. The ocean kept the people and gave back only an empty shell.
All right, let's dive into one of the greatest, most chilling maritime mysteries of all time, the Mary Celeste. We're talking about a ship found perfectly sound, sailing on its own in the middle of the Atlantic, but with every single soul on board just gone. And that really is the heart of the mystery, isn't it? How do 10 experienced people, including a captain, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, make the absolutely terrifying decision to abandon a perfectly good ship for a tiny little lifeboat? What could possibly make you do that in the middle of the vast, empty ocean? Were they running from some kind of sea monster? Or were they running from an invisible killer, lurking right there under their very feet? So, to get our bearings, let's just quickly run through the timeline. The Mary Celeste leaves New York on November 7th, 1872. Everything seems normal. The captain's last log entry is on November 24th. A day later, there's a quick note on the ship's slate. And then nothing, just radio silence. 9 days later, on December 4th, another ship, the De Gracia, stumbles upon her, completely deserted. And this discovery, this is where the story truly goes from a simple voyage to something else entirely. The crew of the De Gracia boarded what was basically a floating crime scene, a ghost ship perfectly preserved in the middle of the sea. Okay, so what they found on board is what makes this so baffling. The ship itself was in great shape. Yeah, it was a little wet. There was about a meter of water in the hold, but nothing a good crew couldn't handle. The sails were still up, but the ship's only lifeboat was gone. And here's the really weird part. All the crew's personal stuff, money, valuables, clothing, all of it was still there, untouched. But the captain's navigational tools, his sextant and chronometer, were missing. This wasn't piracy. This looks like a very deliberate but very panicked evacuation. So investigators immediately started looking at the one thing that stood out, the cargo. The Mary Celeste was carrying 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol. We're talking highly volatile industrial-grade stuff. And when that cargo was finally unloaded, a huge clue finally emerged. Out of all those barrels, 9 of them were empty. Now, 9 doesn't sound like a lot, but it was just enough to spark the biggest, most plausible scientific theory for this whole mystery. And this brings us to what I like to call the invisible killer theory. The idea that something unseen, something silent, but absolutely terrifying, convinced 10 people to flee for their lives. So, here's how it probably went down. Those 9 empty barrels, they weren't empty because someone drank the alcohol. They were likely made of a more porous type of wood, and they leaked alcohol fumes into the sealed cargo hold. As those vapors built up, the pressure could have created a huge ignitionless explosion, basically a terrifyingly loud whoosh of sound that blew the hatch covers open. There was no fire, but Captain Briggs wouldn't have known that. To him, it would have sounded like the entire ship was about to become a giant floating bomb. His first and only thought, get everyone off, now. And listen, this isn't just a wild guess. This theory is actually backed by science. An experiment at the University of London recreated these exact conditions in a scale model. And what happened? They generated a vapor explosion strong enough to blow the hatches right off, but it left 0 scorch marks. It didn't even damage fragile paper placed inside. It was, for all intents and purposes, a perfect invisible explosion. But as compelling as that invisible killer theory is, it's not the only possibility on the table. We've also got to look at other ideas, from just a freak act of nature to a simple but tragic human mistake. So on one side, you have natural disasters. Maybe a waterspout hit the ship, dumped a bunch of water on deck, and just freaked everyone out. On the other side, you've got foul play. People immediately thought mutiny or pirates, but the evidence just doesn't add up. The crew was solid, Captain Briggs was respected, and pirates would have definitely taken the valuables. Neither of these theories really explains why they would leave in such an orderly way, taking only their navigational gear. This leads to another fascinating idea based on simple human error, a tiny mistake that could have had catastrophic consequences. We know one of the ship's pumps was a bit dodgy, and we know there was some water in the hold. So what if the device they used to measure that water, the sounding rod, was faulty? Captain Briggs could have taken a measurement, seen a number that was way too high, and believed his ship was taking on water and sinking way faster than it actually was. In that scenario, abandoning ship is the only logical but tragically wrong decision. But, it doesn't really matter why they left. Whether it was a vapor explosion, a water spout, or a bad measurement, it all leads to the exact same heartbreaking final mystery. What happened to those 10 people in that tiny lifeboat? And let's just take a moment to remember who we're talking about. Captain Benjamin Briggs and his wife, Sarah. Their 2-year-old little girl, Sophia. The first mate and a crew of 6 other men. These were real people with lives and families who just vanished. I mean, can you even imagine the absolute terror? 10 people, all huddled together in one little boat, watching their big, safe ship, their only real hope, just drift away from them into the endless, empty ocean. Their fate was most likely sealed by the ocean itself. Records show a nasty storm hit that area shortly after they would have abandoned the Mary Celeste. It's very possible they had tied a rope from their lifeboat to the big ship, hoping to climb back on when the danger passed. And then the storm snapped the line. In that kind of weather, a tiny lifeboat wouldn't have stood a chance. It could have been swamped by a wave or maybe even hit by a waterspout and just erased. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing was ever confirmed to be found. And that's what it all comes down to, right? Abandoning your ship is the absolute last thing a sailor ever does. It goes against every instinct. Something happened that day that made Captain Briggs believe that staying on his perfectly good ship was somehow more dangerous than getting into that tiny boat. In the end, the Mary Celeste was found, but its souls were not. It's been over 150 years, and the ocean is still holding on to the answer. So what do you think? Do you believe it was a freak chemical accident, or was some other, maybe even supernatural force at play that day that simply erased them from existence? Let me know what you think. The mystery for now remains unsolved.
In the mountains, under the waves, and across the vast seas, these 3 tragedies remind us of our own fragility. When isolation sets in, the line between survival and the unknown becomes paper thin. These souls vanished into the elements, leaving us only to wonder about their final breath. Which of these silent ends haunts you the most? Share your thoughts below. The wild doesn't care about our stories, it only keeps the traces. This is Terminal Trace,